So there are three interesting questions which was pointed out by Anu Kolav Singh on LinkedIn. I'll quickly read them out. So he points out that while we are focusing on evergreening of drugs, are we also considering evergreening of medical devices? Then another comment that he made was ODOP is a result of incentive theory for GI in his opinion. So any thoughts on that? And then the third question that he raised was the price of stents have been regulated for now, but are we still being enslaved? NPPI monitors the price, but do they in fact, I think he means factor in the cost of production of biomechanical devices? Also point out a question raised by Sonisha, asking for an elaboration on how ideas of ascetisation that was mentioned, I think, by Ishupal apply to the three examples of stakeholder authors, laborers, and farm artisans in terms of affecting them. So yeah,
Shall I take the two questions first?
yep, sure,
I'm
sure.
putting in chat this article on sabotage. It's essentially called "Tariffs and the Ends of International Economic Law." I think written last year when the tariff thing like started happening, and whatever I could like pick from it was Veblen kind of critiques this idea that capitalism leads to innovation and so on. That it's not that capitalists in their competition innovate necessarily. They also use ways to kind of get this unfair advantage, like or an advantage that is not their innovating, but by regulating or restraining other competitors and so on, right? And I think then Tina kind of brings that to international economic law. That international economic law or international trade law is a way for capitalist of a particular country to kind of lobby setting off of sabotage for capitalist of other countries and so on, right? So it takes us out of this narrative of international intellectual property law only through foreign direct investment or this kind of like narrative, that actually it is also a way of sabotaging, and which we have been like sort of like I think when Akshat was talking about, I could think of this when I think he was giving the example of Afghanistan, he was giving the example of Pakistan. I could think that yes, absolutely that. So but more importantly for me is uh, this question of metaphors and narratives, to take the question of metaphors and narratives seriously, like what do they show us, what do they hide, is something which I think is interesting. And of course, Mario Biagli and others have this article called "Weighing Intellectual Property," which kind of questions this weighing metaphor, right? And I think it talks about it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as I understand, the question is, what does assetization has to do with economic interests of different sections of societies? First of all, I think that was what I was trying to say was that this assumption that just introducing intellectual property rules would lead to better economic situation for women, which the article itself, which that is I think initially what I meant, that the writings have an indiscipline to them, so they are bringing a lot of other concerns. So I've never read an intellectual property article, at least recently, which gives a cross section of the agricultural section in India and shows that 90%, like a significant of them, is women, and most of the women are farm laborers, not even owners, right? So I think the article does a very good of opening up these categories and so on. At some places, it makes this assumption that just introducing, for example, GI laws or any other kind of laws would help all of them, right? So that is what I was kind of questioning. But it is also related, like for this also, I'll just give this reference. Yu Kang has an article, Patents as Assets, in the Assetization book. I'll put a link to it, where she explains that, and again, we like even in even in intellectual property scholarship, we kind of know that it has moved from privilege to commodity to investment and so on, right? So what this article does is not only in terms of international investment law, but also in a much more how patents are being used. It talks about patent portfolios, it talks about patent valuations and so on. And it relates to this debate: are we kind of moving beyond neoliberalism? Are we going again into some kind of techno feudalism and all of that and so on? And patents and this valuation that they enable certain actors to corner is very important part of it. And I would even say that if you read the introduction chapter on assetization, the lot of like defining of asset is very similar to intellectual property. Like it's about how to maximize your rents, how to stabilize excluding other people from using it. And what they say essentially is that, and I think this is the argument, that we need to bring intellectual property back to and which again I think Akshat was mentioning, that to a policy level, to being an industrial policy, to be part of other kind of regulation where it could play a role, rather than this link between more IP, more development, more value, and more progress. So that is why in terms it is related. Like assetization has kind of increased global inequality. There are interesting articles even about India. Even in India, the intangible assets, the value of intangible assets has increased, and that has kind of increased the gap on inequality standards also. So that is how also it's kind of related. Yeah.
Uh, I think, perhaps there was a question on the evergreening aspect, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken.
Yeah. I'll quickly repeat that. Give me 1 second, Shama. Yeah, it was a question saying, while we are focusing on evergreening of drugs, are we also considering evergreening of medical devices?
Right. So I think, I mean, from the, if I'm to like contextualize it in the sense of the chapter, I think what the proposition there was first questioning how strong is the rationale itself when we say evergreening, right? Is it really possible? And if it is so, uh, what should be the response? So in that sense, I think the chapter also talks about the compulsory licensing regime, which already sort of exists in the Patent Act. So would that, number one, be offered, is capable of being a solution? And if I'm to just think of like Section 3D and contextualize it, I think the wording is such, for example, I think it uses the word substance and then goes on. So in that, would medical technology really fall is also would be an interpretational, I think, question. So from that point of view, I don't think Section 3D would directly maybe apply to medical technology, given it may not always be seen as a substance. But then again, is it possible? And if, assuming even if it's possible, the fact that the Patent Act does have, you know, other options or solutions, are they adequate enough? Maybe that can be looked into, and if they are, then I think that possibility sort of would be negated. I think that would be my take on it. Other panelists, if they have any.
Okay, so I assume no one else wants to add on that. I had a question which I'd like to put forward to all three of you. It's a bit of, I guess it may be considered a bit of a radical position, perhaps fairly so. This IP innovation link that is uh, rightfully being questioned, I want to reframe that in a slightly different angle. So innovation and the sort of more refined version of that progress, maybe not refined version, but maybe the more refined idea of what we mean when we say innovation, which is perhaps progress. Um, so we are constantly, okay, let me take off from the tech tech bros industry more specifically, move fast and break something approach to things, right? uh, there's more and more literature coming out on the value of maintenance and repair, right? And so as we sort of like let's say in the context of inequality where various factors are contributing to this, what if I could put the question in front of three of you, what your takes are on maybe as industrial policy, we should not focus on newness right now, right? And this is a bit of a radical take because there's a constant race and your GDP and what will happen to blah 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 blah. So, but if we focus more on repair, on maintenance, on inclusion, on so do you see a place for that? Let's say first in theory as a good idea, and second in practice, do you see that as ever being a acceptable, a palatable idea? Whether there will be enough political will to implement a version of industrial policy which says, we don't need the latest, greatest, blah, blah, blah. We need to make sure we have robust, sturdy, inclusive development.
So I feel there's a disconnect between IP and innovation, and there's a reason for that. The reason is the framing of the justification. And we have had a lot of conversations about incentive over here since Shama's talk and Professor Ishupal's talk as well. So I think the framing of the narrative goes like this: we want a lot of innovation. To have a lot of innovation as a matter of industrial policy. So to have a lot of innovation as a matter of industrial policy, we need to provide a lot of incentives. And to provide a lot of incentives, we need to provide a lot of patents. That's the narrative that goes through. But there's a disconnect, right? The disconnect is in the understanding that for achieving the industrial policy goals of having a lot of innovation, or which results in so-called progress, you need to give incentives to people. I mean, that's where the theory breaks apart, because the actual framing should have rather been that for people who want to pursue something that we value in the end as a matter of progress in our society, they need to pursue it without being scared of surviving in a market society, right? Which is also the means to the end of progress, according to them. So we need something that will make sure that they continue to do what they are doing in this market society and are able to sustain and survive. That is different from incentivizing. That is protecting. That is enabling. That is enabling them to survive. And once that framing shift happens, automatically the narrative focus changes from incentive to something which is a little more limited idea of enabling them to survive in a market society and yet want to continue to do what they're doing and not shift to other vocations where the chances of surviving or being prosperous are higher in a market society. So once we understand that, the whole focus of this narrative changes. So earlier it was innovation linked to progress, for more innovation, incentive, for more incentive, more patents. But now this changes it from, okay, we live in a market society. Let's take it for a taken. I need to survive. I'm in the vocation of production of non-rivalrous intangible resources. So it's tough for me to survive. So what do I get? I get something right now as a matter of a property right to be able to, in a limited manner, to the extent that I'm able to survive in a market society and continue to choose that as a vocation, as again shifting out of it. And then I continue to produce, which will ultimately lead to the end goal of innovation and progress, as they call it, right? So I think that narrative shift helps us to curtail the scope of things and then imagine development or progress in a more holistic manner from a more holistic understanding of what actually a market society sort of induces.
Thanks, Akshat. There are more questions coming in as well. But if anyone else has thoughts on this and would like to go ahead, please do.
Yeah, just a few things. I think I'm with you on this essentially. Like I am on your side of the radical position. So I don't know like how to think. There are many ways of I think assetization is one, that there is nothing materially happening. It's all speculative value which is happening, and it is changing our societies and so on. But the other thing which I think maintenance and repair, also there is a lot of STS scholarship on that it is actually maintenance and repair and like all of that, which which is important, which provides social values and so on. So one thing which kind of I found interesting and changed my mind on this was Lily Irani's Chasing Innovation. It's about India, so and she and it's not essentially IP based, but it's more on what you said, entrepreneurship and this kind of design thinking, all of that. So it's there, but I think it's very interesting for anyone who's working on knowledge policy and all of that and so on. And one of the things she says is that innovation has become has kind of this dominant narrative where there might be difference in position, but it has become this meta narrative, and she questions that. And her fieldworks are interesting in this like all these questions of what kind of technology people want, what kind of technology the planners like think would work for normal people, for all people, and so on. So she brings out this very interesting that, and I think if I remember, the subtitle of the book is entrepreneurship citizenship. That even to be a proper citizen, you have to have an entrepreneurial state of mind, which kind of then leads you like to not ask certain kind of political social kind of questions and go towards. So that's one. The other thing is this movement, and also I think scholarship on degrowth, which kind of puts the question on progress and technology heavy kind of progress itself. So the way they think about technology, relationship of knowledge and so on, is also something which so the relationship between degrowth and technology is also something I think like is very similar and asks similar kind of question that you mentioned. So yeah, I think I've been like sort of thinking about and like found these kind of scholarship kind of interesting and really like raising this kind of question. Yeah.
I think based on both of what they said, like Akshat and Professor Ishupal, I think what it brings to my mind from something that I read recently, I think is this negative theory or negative space of IP. I don't know which I think Rosenblatt has proposed, and it's more functional in the fashion sense, where I think there is no strong IP, right? And still you see innovation happen, you see things move forward. So that goes back to the question of how much IP and innovation should be linked. So I think that also is a very interesting theory, and yeah, sort of like relates to what you are asking. And I think there is, I don't know, there's not much, I didn't find much readings on it other than Rosenblatt, and then I think in the fashion industry it has been taken forward, and there are 2 articles by on it. But yeah, I think that is also something that relates to this, and it's yeah, to me that would sort of be linked.
Definitely. Thanks. Again, I won't go further on this, but thanks to all of you for your reading suggestions, especially. Lots to go back and read. We have one question from Niharika. Thank you, everyone, for your enriching thoughts. In terms of representation, where do you think the book lacks, or what are some missing points, some major missing points in the book?
If I may, just add on to the question which was raised by Niharika, who's also a co-author on one of these chapters. I just wanted to add another question to it, based on a very interesting observation that Swaraj made yesterday, that all 3 of our panelists are people who are in different rungs of IP academia. We have Shama, who's pursuing LLM, Akshat, who's a PhD candidate, and Ishupal, who's an associate professor. What we understood from this discussion, that this book is sort of one of those books which fundamentally opens conversation on different set of questions. One thing that Ishupal pointed out in his discussion was that there could be other historical POVs through which we could be looking at some of the issues raised here. I would like to know, maybe pick your brains on what are the other areas you think that this book kind of opens up the avenue to lead discussion on. What are the other areas where you think that, okay, fine, we have had this, now the discussion could perhaps go in the other direction. I know it's kind of a heavy and a vague question, but at the same time, if you have any quick thoughts, would really appreciate that.
Maybe I'll just, because I just talked about the negative space of IP, I'll go back to that one sentence, which I sort of like stuck with me, is the fact that the IP systems, because the way they were like sort of brought in this region, and there was, I think it's made it like there is a lot of reference to it in the chapters to say that, there is no, let's say, a historical or cultural sort of justifications that can be found in this rooted in this region. Then I think more. I don't know, more discussions on this doctrine of the negative space of IP, and how, if at all, in the Asian perspective, would it be viewed? How in this region would it be seen? And why just maybe limited to, a fashion sort of an industry? And how does it then function maybe in all of these IP, like geographical indications or copyright, trademarks, patents? How would that sort of interact, maybe specifically in this region, where I think, if I may take the liberty of saying, there is more acceptance of innovation or anything happening without there being a constant need for claiming exclusivity, right? And so I think in that sense, maybe that would be an interesting thing to, because I did not like yet come across something in my this perspective, like integrating these two things. So maybe, I think to me that would be something interesting. Yeah.
I just have two things. On the first question by Niharika, I think the book actually opens a lot of research avenues. It provides a lot of food for thought for complementary studies that can be conducted, which ties into Praharsh's question, right? So, one thing that could be done is basically a more historically contextual analysis of these jurisdictions that have been sort of spoken about in the book in a much more detailed study, where the context of how IP came in, and how what specific contours of their cultural sort of practices that are being directly affected by IP, and what used to happen earlier to induce those practices, as compared to the effects of IP. And just tracing that change could be a very helpful study for growing scholarship in this area. And I think the other way to go about it could be to question, to sort of further use these narratives, use these case studies of these different jurisdictions to ultimately come to questioning the use of exclusionary rights in general for satisfying these, tying back to what Shama said, right? Use of exclusionary rights in general to sort of achieve the policy goals that a lot of these laws seek to, right? So first, questioning the goals themselves in regard to the cultural positioning or context of the particular jurisdiction, and secondly, questioning the use of exclusionary rights for achieving the goals, if any. I think that could be a good research agenda that we follow and learn a lot from the perspectives in this book as narrative case studies.
Yeah, I think on I think similar lines again, that we've you have these grand historical narratives, but there could also be smaller histories and so on. And again, like on the second part that I saw, like it's very tentative. I've no like I've never like sort of worked on it, or like but yeah, I think the different parts of the readings and different like sort of aspect made me kind of like think about it. And one thing I could think is, I was listening to a talk on the notion of South Asia. It was again in an STS conference. And the way they were kind of interrogating the term itself was very interesting. Like, not necessarily we have to follow that. Like, there was one speaker who was talking about, if I remember, I'll try to, after the talk, I'll try to see the reference, talking about certain parts of South Asia. I think she was from Nepal, and that certain industries in Nepal were never part of the colonial economic system. They were producing and consuming for their own. So there could, again, this is not directly relevant to us, but it again makes us think of differences or different kind of effect the colonial system had on different regions in this part of the world. So that was very interesting. That and I think her again hypothesis was the region above the Shivalik has had a certain different kind of economic relationship with different one. Though it was questioned by others, saying that, oh, you seem to be kind of again romanticizing South Asia and not like questioning our own problems and so on. So there was a good dialogue in it. But I think that is what I meant by like there could be other kind of historical narrative which would go well with and as Akshat was saying, that it could like enrich and be more detailed kind of picture to us. So yeah.
If I may, there's one thing which it's like a perpetual uh, itch I need to scratch, which is the question of funding, right? Because ultimately, funding is determining what gets published, what gets researched, what gets looked at, what gains visibility also, right? And as much as the internet is supposed to be equalizing the world, it's maybe not as simple as that, right? So, um, in fact, Niharika herself, in a previous session that we did online, she was also talking about funding issues and what a difference it makes to the type of research you're able to do, right? And in the IP context, and this is something that I mentioned in the beginning, and Ishupal had mentioned in between as well, about the slow or what appears to be the gradual change from a more politically active set of actors and slowly depoliticization of that, right? And there's surely there's several factors that relate to this, amongst of which maybe simply a surfeit of activity could be one of those factors, right? And now there, of course, a simple example is there's a lot of money in AI, and that's where everyone is throwing more and more money, and we will see more conversations on that. Does that mean that's the necessarily those angles are the most important angles to be looking at? Who knows? It may be, it may not be, but it's undeniable that the money is determining why that it's being looked at. So yeah, this question of funding, and again, I mean, I don't, I can't say that's a critique of the book per se, because that's a topic of its own, right? It's a whole area to go into, and there's so much research, because who funds research into funding? That's another question, right? But yeah, that's one area that I would like to see more, at least discussion, if not research and writing on. Sorry, Sonisha, I think you had a follow-up question which we didn't get to. Would you want to just go ahead and mention it?
Yeah. So firstly, thank you so much. I think it was a great session in terms of like seeing how the three of you, mentioned about the three parts and how it all tied in together. So that was another thing that I was thinking of when you were mentioning about assetization. The first thing that came into my mind was Akshat's idea of commodification versus cultural expression. So the fact that when you mentioned that anything can be turned into assets and how that plays around with um, in terms of people, the stakeholders who are being affected. So that was one thing that I was thinking of on how that idea plays into Akshat, your thoughts on how the difference between something being commodified and the real cultural expression in that sense. So something like not converting IP or anything into just a property, but looking at alternatives and looking at a more like bringing about the idea of expression rather than commodifying it as an asset. I don't know if it made sense, but
No, I mean, it ties directly to the Nepali, to the Sri Lankan example, right? Where the way they have regulated folklore is by not commodifying it or tying it to any individual's ownership that can be sort of transacted into or exchanged on the hand of the market, right? So they have changed that to providing designating an administrative officer to a particular body and then allowing them regulatory powers of getting a small fee for everyone who wants to use it, right? And using that fee further, not to again put it on the market, but rather to invest in as a cess in the cultural development. So there are many models, I mean, I'll drop in the reference for you on how different regulatory models have come in. Professor William Fisher had a book called Promises to Keep. There was chapter 5 in that book, which talks about various different kinds of models that have come in around the world to sort of, induce creation as expression, which is not transacted on the logic of the market. But I mean, it's tough to implement because everything else is on the market, right? So once everything else is on the market model, to not have this drives people who want to pursue this as a vocation away from pursuing it. Because you live in a competitive society, not just competitive in terms of within vocations, but also across vocations. So then implementing it becomes tough. But we can see a first step, right, of sort of harmonizing cultural context with some kind of enablement for people who are actually a part of that community or who want to actually practice folklore expression, right? So in my view, it's a very good lesson for Indian classical music, right? The lesson from Sri Lanka.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonisha, for that wonderful question, and Akshat, for your explanation. I think we'd be wrapping it up here since we are at the 4 o'clock mark. So I'd like to quickly extend a very heartfelt thank you to our panelists and to Swaraj and Sonisha for being present here and for this enriching discussion, and to all our audience members who pitched in with some wonderful, interesting questions. So, yeah, thank you.